Hi, I'm Southampton Town Supervisor Jay Schneiderman, and welcome to Talk of the Town, where we take a close look at issues facing our community. And today we're going to be talking about energy and electricity in particular. It's on everybody's mind because we all pay our electricity bills. But it's also on people's mind because the way we produce our electricity sometimes can impact our planet. And we have seen that with increasing concern about global warming and our reliance on non-renewable sources and how that is affecting our planet with rising temperatures and how that is really impacting everything from rising sea levels to the ability of various plants and animals to even exist where they are. So the town embarked on a new program to look at becoming a bulk purchaser of electricity, which is kind of an unusual thing called this Community Choice Aggregation, or CCA. And we brought in an administrator, Jewel Assets, to help us. And I have a team here in the studios here at CTV. To my left, we have Lynn Arthur, who's a consultant on energy issues to the town. And you have your own company, Lynn?
Yeah, I founded a not-for-profit called Peak Power Long Island.
So Peak Power Long Island. And of course, John Bouvier, who's a councilman and liaison to our sustainability efforts, our sustainability committee. And then Glenn Weinberg, who's vice president at Jewel Assets, who was chosen or selected as our CCA administrator. So there's a lot to this issue. And maybe, Lynn, I'll start with you, because I think you brought this sort of to our attention, this idea that we could bargain for and be bulk purchasers of energy on behalf of our residents with the hope that we could not only lower our costs, but maybe move away from reliance on fossil fuels. So can you talk a little bit about how we got into this whole thing and why?
Sure. It was actually back in 2018. I was invited up to a conference that was sponsored by Westchester, in Westchester, by Sustainable Westchester, which is a not-for-profit. And they were discussing the results of a two-year pilot, which, by the way, Jewel Community Power shepherded with, I think it was, 16, 18, 20 different municipalities?
Yeah, we launched with 20, yep.
And at that time, at the conference, they were talking about how they had saved millions of dollars over a two-year period in aggregate for somewhere around maybe 100,000 residents. And they did that by issuing a competitive bid for electricity. And they awarded that to an electric service company, also known as an ESCO, who won that bid. But more importantly, and certainly, for us on the East End, they were able to get a price that was very competitive, and it was from 100% renewable sources. So they made that decision, and as I sat there in the audience, I said to myself, how come I have never heard of this? This is a wonderful thing. And then within a year, other municipalities elsewhere outside the LIPA service area, upstate New York, were taking on the same program and the same approach. And so I came back to the committee, and through John's leadership and your leadership and talking to the town board, we started investigating it, and that's how we got started. So,
to the consumer, they flick a switch and the lights come on, right? And we also know from these mass blackouts that occurred years ago that there's this thing called a grid, right? There's an interconnectivity. And when you flick that light switch on and lights, there's electrons moving through your wires, but those electrons originate from somewhere, right? And on Long Island, there's a couple big power plants. There's one up in Port Jeff, and there's one up in Northport, and then there's other sources. But all those generators will sort of dump power into a grid. So how is it that we can get electricity from an ESCO or some other source than the ones that are nearby? Can maybe, Glenn, do you want to try to answer that?
Sure, yeah, there's a couple ways. There are ways to schedule the power, to actually transmit over the transmission lines and physically deliver into to a different zone. So Long Island is fairly unique, right, because of geographically of where we are here and the logistics of that. So actually most of the power here on Long Island is generated on island, right, as you mentioned, from Northport and Port Jeff. In other parts of the grid, even upstate New York, it's a little bit more open geographically. There's more power being transmitted long distances and delivered into other zones. But there's also a financial and labeling component of renewable energy in New York as well, right? So sometimes when you buy renewable electricity, it doesn't necessarily mean that those electrons are going to find, those green electrons are going to find your way to your home or business. In many cases, those electrons are indistinguishable once they're in the grid. They're mixed with gas and nuclear electrons. It's very difficult to parse out what's physically in the wires. That's why New York State and many other states and nations around the world have created systems for accounting for renewable energy, where it's generated and who is buying it. So who gets that claim over the renewable content of that power, and to make sure that there is only one customer that ultimately gets the claim over that. So that system is in place in New York, and that's really the economy of renewable energy, is done through that system. There's a tracking system maintained statewide, and Long Island can tap into that. So even though there aren't a lot of wholesale solar or wind projects yet here on Long Island, they can still tap into that statewide economy for renewable energy.
So, there are wind turbines being built,
Right.
And there's lots of solar arrays, and where town is actually working on them. But and maybe this is for you, Glenn, too. So people know PSEG, which is, I guess, the manager for Long Island Power Authority, which is a quasi-public,
Yes.
entity. So. A lot of people in other places, they have private utilities. We have this sort of public utility, though it doesn't have an elected body governing it as an appointed body. So who determines, how are our rates for electricity currently set? Who is making that? Who is deciding where the power is purchased and at what price?
Yeah, so interestingly on Long Island, and most Long Islanders, including my own family who I talked to about this, they think LIPA is gone, right? Because they see on their bill PSEG, PSEG Long Island. They think that's their utility now. In fact, LIPA still exists, as you mentioned, and it is LIPA that makes those procurement decisions ultimately. So they are playing that formal utility role of where are we buying our power, at what price, right, from whom. And so that the rate is, of course, largely derived by those procurement decisions. So it's really LIPA that still today are making those decisions that is going to ultimately determine what you pay for your electricity on your bill. PSEG is, as you said, they're a vendor or a subcontractor or a manager that is playing also a number of those sort of traditional utility roles, including billing and metering and that sort of thing, and maintenance of the grid. But ultimately, those procurement decisions are still being made by LIPA.
So the power plants themselves are owned by who? It could be separate companies?
Yeah, they're private,
They're
private generation companies that may
Right.
also be.
And then the power lines are owned by the people, right? That's LIPA that owns the power
Distribution
lines.
system.
And then PSEG is a management entity hired by LIPA to bill us and to maintain things, right?
To maintain the grid.
So John, you saw an opportunity here to do things different, right? To push a little bit more to the renewable side and maybe lower the rates for our consumers. So really, John, what got you interested in doing this and taking this on?
Well, as you said before, when Lynn first came to the town and started talking to us, none of us, I think, were aware of what CCA really was, and the concept sounded good. So the first thing I did was call other municipalities and get their opinions. Westchester, I think, is the first county that's done it on Long Island. There's, I believe, 16 states across the country or more that have adopted some form of of permitting this, either to pursue it, to investigate it, and to go forward with it. In the state of New York right now, there's quite a few municipalities, but it was an interesting cause, because I hear these things and they always sound great, but we have the third or fourth highest price per kilowatt hour of any municipality in the country. That's very high, and it affects our residents, and people talk about that, particularly people of moderate income, it's a big part of their bill, and it shouldn't be. So when I heard that, when I heard the success of that, it was sort of a no-brainer at that point. But the question was how to pursue it. There is a lot of legislative obstacles that we've been going through for many years now to get to this point. I have to give a lot of credit to Fred Thiel, Assemblyman Thiel, who's really been working with us to get to that point. And he's been a solid supporter of this, and we've been working legislation through, particularly with LIPA. You may be aware of they're looking at LIPA and how to revamp LIPA. LIPA is an unusual entity in that it's sort of a quasi-public-private sort of power authority. It's unusual. It's unique within the country. And that's posed some obstacles to get to where we are. But to give them credit, they've worked with us as best we can. I think certainly Fred's efforts have brought us to that. But our goal in sustainability, obviously, is to make renewable energy more available. And part of the CCA projects are things called community distributed generation, where we look at areas where we can put solar panels or wind, where it's not affecting neighbors, where it's land that's costly to build, and we can have contracts with people who will take that mitigation, satisfy the DEC requirements to use that land, and it makes absolutely perfect sense. And we're doing this right now at virtually no cost to the town, and through great organizations like Dual Asset, they've been through this, so they were great to guide us, and under Lynn's leadership on this regard, helping bring the community into this to understand it. Part of the process that we're here today for is to help inform people. We're doing public outreach now,
Sure.
which is part of the requirement. So to answer your question simply, it was a no-brainer to go forward, to be able to offer people the ability to get their energy through non-renewable cycles, as opposed to just being at the whim and will of an organization and being told what your rates are going to be. And
We
drive
get
them
it
down.
from renewable resources.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
So when we as a town board first got into this and we authorized, we selected Jewel, and they were then able to, I guess, get all the billing information from PSAG so that they knew how much usage there was. But I remember there were some roadblocks in terms of whether CCA was even authorized in an area where you had this LIPA operating, this public utility.
Well,
those roadblocks, I guess, have been, you were able to get all the information, right, to do the analysis, and now the PSC, the Public Service Commission, they have authorized this, right? So you clearly can do CCA in this community.
As of 2016, in that time period, that's when the law is listed. But there's more to do to make that work
so is
the
there
way we
anything,
like to.
and CCA is basically, we take all of our ratepayers cumulatively. I don't know how many there are. Thousands.
Tens of thousands, yeah.
Tens of thousands.
Yeah.
And they act as a bulk purchaser, right? And so we are bargaining on their behalf, and we're saying to these energy producers, we have 60,000 customers, or whatever it might be, that use X amount of energy, and we want to know what you're going to charge us over the next few years for that on a per kilowatt basis, or we're not, or we're not going to buy from you. We're going to buy from somebody else, even though they might not even have a power plant in our community. It's part of that larger grid, right?
Exactly right.
So that's sort of how that works.
Yeah, it's the buying power. So it's allowing a large number of residential and small business customers to aggregate collective, buying power, bring that out to market, just as you said, and act as if they were a much larger consumer and dictate the terms of how they'd like to buy energy, from which sources, at what price, for what term, those sorts of things, and command competition from the market that way, and ultimately it drives price down for consumers. It stabilizes prices over long periods of time, and it allows communities like Southampton to say, we'd like renewable sources, not traditional fossil. And here on Long Island, where this grid is close to 90% fossil, so it's a really impactful,
Well, I know one of the things we had insisted on when we went into contract with Joule is that the resulting price to our consumers had to be less than what it currently is, and we don't know that yet. So when do we know that we'll be able to procure power at a lower cost, and when are they able to reap the benefit? Maybe Lynn.
Actually, I would send this over to Glenn, if you don't mind.
Okay.
About the
I can give you a
timeline.
sense of timeline. So it's timely here to be talking about it this spring, because that request for proposals, that competitive bid, is going out this spring. We're going to receive proposals back, including pricing, early in the summer, and we'll hopefully be moving towards finalizing that negotiation and executing a contract in about the middle of the summer. And that means that in the fall, folks will start to hear about this a little bit more. They'll get a letter in the mail explaining the program, what their options are, what the rates are, how those rates compare to LIPA's most recent rates, et cetera. Have a chance to decide whether they'd like to participate or not. If they don't want to participate, there are easy ways to opt out: phone call, email, web form, prepaid postcard. We make it easy for folks that don't want to participate to remove themselves from the list. And then the expectation is that we will launch, meaning that consumers in Southampton will have a new supplier, no longer LIPA, but a new supplier as of January 1st of next year.
And if I could just put a finer point on a few comments that Glenn just made, consumers will have a choice. Even though the town board will have the opportunity, they'll be presented options as a result of this competitive bid that Glenn referenced, that you will choose the default supplier. You'll see all the responses. You'll make the decision on the default supplier, meaning everyone who's eligible under the program to be in the program will get the default supplier, because it's an opt-out program, and we'll talk about that in a second. But each individual homeowner or renter or small business who's eligible will have the option to choose from the other options. So they'll automatically get the default unless they choose one of the other options. So that's why we have branded the program Choice Community Power, because now consumers will have choices that they don't have today. And the other finer point that I wanted to make is that, back to what John was saying, an individual customer can't negotiate, because they don't have enough power, right? There's just one customer. LIPA, PSEG, they provide options, and you choose from the rates that they decide that they publish. With this program, the electric service company, the ESCO that wins the bid, is signing a contract where the terms are dictated by you. So we're not signing their contract, they're signing your contract. And so those options, there are options that...
So who does that billing if some consumer picks a different provider? Because you're giving them a range of different providers? Is that how that's working?
Glenn, if you...
Yeah, that's
How do you
actually the
keep
really
track of
nice
that?
thing. It's always still the one bill, right? So it'll still be from PSEG. They are still going to be the deliverer of energy, as they always are, and the only thing that will change is the supply portion of your bill. Your electricity bill is actually two bills: your supply rate and your supply charges, and then your delivery rate and your delivery charges. What CCA allows you to do is to select an alternative supplier for that top part of your bill. So if traditionally it's always been LIPA or now PSEG on that bill, it will remain so. They'll still be the ones to repair the grid when there's an outage. They're still the ones you call if you have an issue with your bill or your service is out. However, the town now, CCA gives the town the authority to say, well, we'd like to see what the other options are for the supply portion. And as Lynn was saying, there's actually multiple, typically in a CCA program, there's actually multiple options that each consumer will have. So typically a 100% renewable and a 50% renewable, and even maybe other options. So there are even options within the program for consumers to switch to decide between.
And I think that's, just to add, I think that's really important if you consider the way renewable energy is expanding and how rapidly it's expanding in both technology but also location. And we can provide local sources of power into that if that proves to be viable to do, cost-wise and otherwise. We also get hopefully fixed prices so that as consumer knows that they're going to get a kilowatt rate that's going to be consistent for a period of time in front of them and not keep jumping up and around. And I think that's critical as well.
Excuse me.
That we're able to provide the sources of those power and be able to make that choice. Particularly, it makes it more flexible. It's a lot more flexible than a giant organization, a power authority, because we can make those choices as we come across new technologies, new developments that help us even drive those prices down or increase the availability of renewable sourced energy.
So, John, you had mentioned before something in terms of local sources of power, and I think there's a name for it, distributed community.
Community distributed generation.
So we have some of that happening now.
Mm-hmm. At North Sea, we have a solar array that we're ready to put in.
No, that's on the old landfill.
Over the old landfill. And we've identified 10 to 15 other areas across the town of Southampton where this is also a potential to do. And these are on properties like transfer stations. You know, you're not going to build a building on a transfer station. Or in areas that are severe brownfield sites that just require remediation, as I said before. And those sites will be able to contribute into the grid that our customers could avail themselves of here locally. And that's a big deal when you start to look at what that does, particularly in local areas. I think that's the pilot is in North Sea. We'll see how that goes. If it works well, we can do more of these. We can provide lower rates. We're thinking of doing something like a star equivalent program for energy, where people can, people of lower fixed or moderate income, and that's for the town to decide, can avail themselves of a lower cost per kilowatt hour price, which is hugely significant, particularly if you're talking about affordable housing. Making housing affordable is not just an affordable building, but it's affordable to operate. And I think that's really important to a lot of these initiatives that you and I have worked on over the years.
When we first arrived, like almost 8 years ago, right?
Yeah.
One of the first things we did is we sort of set a goal for increasing or trying to reduce our use of non-renewables, right? So we said, I think it was by 2025, we wanted to be 100%. And our electricity would be from renewable sources. Are we anywhere near accomplishing that?
Well, if we won't know until the proposals come back, but if the town board chooses the 100% renewable source then you have beat your own goal. You will have made that in 2023.
Well, I know this from
exactly what I would have said.
So this program has the potential to allow us to meet that goal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the Sustainability Committee is thrilled.
So I know, Lynn, you have brought to the board on multiple occasions concern about peak demand, that particularly in the summer when everybody turns on their air conditioners, and suddenly there's the inability for the current suppliers to meet that demand. And they forecast growing demand and more big homes, and then they say, oh, we're going to need more power plants and more overhead wires. And I know you've been very big on conservation and trying to get people to go to solar and smart thermostats and all kinds of things that would help us avoid the necessity of having more above ground infrastructure and more reliance on non-renewable resources. Can you talk a little bit about how we're doing in terms of meeting the needs of our area?
Yes. Recently, I shared with, I think I shared it with the town board. We asked LIPA for what our consumption has been pre and during the pandemic, and because the number of people that have become full-time residents, our consumption of electricity has actually increased even more, right? So our overall consumption is up. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I do know the consumption in the summer is even more. So the summertime, as you referenced, is when it's the worst. You know, that's when we have very high demand. The population more or less triples, and because of air conditioners, pool pumps, and other devices, and just basically the density of people, consumption is significant. Which is, by the way, why this 5 megawatt, approximately 5 megawatt solar community solar project at North Sea is so important, because it's going to satisfy that need in a place where it's actually being consumed, right? So that's great. And the fact that we've got more projects that we can do in the future will help that problem. But what we have done, the town has a program called Sustainable Southampton, and there's a website, sustainablesouthamptonny.org, which lists 9 programs that help homeowners and renters and small businesses reduce their consumption, as well as introducing different technologies to manage demand so that they can literally turn down their consumption at the peak period when it's the most important. The more renewable and the more building, and CCA contributes to this as well, because CCA creates economic growth because it attracts developers to build projects on Long Island.
So because we only have another minute remaining, and people are going to want to learn more about this, and I know you guys are doing public outreach, you've been holding meetings out there. Just maybe talk a little bit about how the public can get more information, and when they're going to start seeing CCA, and if they want to learn more about how they can, lower their energy footprint through your programs or websites and things like that. So,
well, the programs are the town programs. There are public information meetings, the schedule of which is on the town website. You can just go on the town website and in the search box put Community Choice Aggregation, and that will come up. There's also, we'll be continuing to do this public education throughout the year. Glenn, I mean, isn't that's true throughout the whole?
Yeah, it's ongoing. Now, we're in the sort of formal pre-launch outreach and education period now. But outreach and education never stops as long as the program goes. You can continue to go to Choice Community Power to read more, Jewel Community Power as well, .com, for both to learn more about the program generally and the efforts here in Southampton. There should also be a phone number on the screen as well that you can call. And that's a local call center. That's not an outsourced call center. That's trained staff here in New York to answer all your questions about the program or what's going on here in the town.
well, thank you, all 3 of you, for coming on Talk of the Town. Thank you at home for watching, and we'll see you next time on Talk of the Town.